Good afternoon. My name is Trinella Kane, and as Commissioner of Corporate Services at the City of Markham, I would like to welcome you to Session 5 of the International Online Summit, Becoming Public Art. This exciting 9-week event is presented by the City of Markham in partnership with Art Plus Public Unlimited. I would like to open the proceedings with a land acknowledgement. We begin today by acknowledging that we walk upon the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, and we recognize their history, spirituality, culture, and stewardship of the land. We are grateful to all Indigenous groups for their commitment to protect the land and its resources, and we are committed to reconciliation, partnership, and enhanced understanding. Corporate services at the City of Markham is comprised of 4 departments: legislative services and communications, including corporate communications and community engagement, financial services, information technology services, and sustainability and asset management. You can see that the content of this and other sessions intersects a great deal with city commitments and priorities regarding equity and diversity and accessibility. Markham strives to meet and, where possible, exceed the requirements of the AODA, which is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Given this focus, I'm quite intrigued to learn more today about how we can talk about access in the context of contemporary public art. Now, over to our 2 co-curators, Markham's Yan Wu and Rebecca Carbon of Art Plus Public Unlimited. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Trinella, and the city's videographer, John Lee, for preparing this welcome video for us. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yan Wu, Public Art Curator for the City of Markham. Thank you all for joining us today, especially everyone returning from previous sessions. Hope you like the program we'll put together, and that we will see you again in the coming weeks. 4 more to go. The idea of organizing this summit directly arises from the Markham Public Art Master Plan 2020 to 2024, when we were about to bring the plan forward to the City Council for approval. We tried to strategize on how to raise awareness about the potential impact of the plan, and more importantly, figuring out the best practice to implement it. What are the models, how to move forward, especially for an emerging public art program like ours, still in the process of developing infrastructures and procedures. We thought, why not create an occasion to gather all the great working models in one place and studying them together. Moreover, we wanted to hear everyone's voice along the production line, from artist to curator, planner to architect, designer to fabricator, creator to administrators, conservator to spectators and advocates. Public art making is a collective effort that demands highly complex processes and negotiations. So when the council approved our plan, we brought public art consultant Rebecca Carbon on board to design the summit together with us. It has been an absolutely wonderful experience. Thank you, Rebecca, for your knowledge, insight, and passion, and above all, your firm belief in public art. Originally, the summit was supposed to be a 3-day in-person event back in June. Because of the COVID, we changed it to an online format. It turned out that we're able to reach a global community. My sincere gratitude to those who have reached out with encouraging notes and feedback. It feels so good to know there is a community of colleagues out there who care about the same issues. Looking forward to more exchanges and discussions in the coming weeks. Personally speaking, it has been a great learning curve every step of the way organizing this summit. For example, today's topic is accessibility. It's not just a subject matter to be discussed and awareness to be raised. Most importantly, it is an action plan to be implemented at the level of every single detail. I have to apologize that we were not able to provide ASL service for today's live session. It was an oversight and lesson learned. Before handing it over to Rebecca to introduce today's session, I would like to say a few thank yous. Thanks to everyone at the City of Markham for making this summit happen, the amazing team at the Varley Art Gallery, the great support from the team at Corporate Communication and IT, and most importantly, just like without artists, there wouldn't be any public art. I want to thank all the presenters of this summit. Without you making your project happen and sharing them with us, that wouldn't be the Becoming Public Art Summit. Thank you. Lastly, thanks Kay Pathgrow for the caption service today. Now over to my collaborator, Rebecca Carbon.
Thanks, Jan. It's also been such a pleasure to collaborate with you on pulling this program together in the various forms that it's taken over close to a year. We've had some of the most wonderful conversations as we sort of hash out what this program needs to be and what it should look like in this shifting context that we've all experienced together over the past number of months. Thanks everyone for joining us today from wherever you are. We're thrilled to be sharing today's program with you. Today in our session, Accessibility, I'm so thrilled to share the work of our panelists. Coming to us from Grand Rapids, Michigan, we have Paul Amenta from Site Lab and longtime collaborators Christopher Smit and Jill Vinn from DisArt. I was introduced to the work of Paul, Chris, and Jill when I worked with Kevin, our moderator, on the inaugural Project One in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I was fortunate enough to catch a panel discussion with them then, and I'm very excited about sharing their insights today on this international platform. And from Toronto to the world, I'm thrilled to introduce Mayan Ziv and Devin Ostrom discussing Access Now, an initiative that looks to score and evaluate accessibility of public space and art within public space. And the conversation today will be moderated by independent curator and writer Kevin Boyst. Public space is arguably the most accessible of art venues or platforms, but access and lack of it can take so many forms. Accessibility and lack of it can manifest along so many different lines: physical, spatial, linguistic, social, economic. Our conversation today really looks at the who part of public art's publicness. Who is public art and public space more broadly for? Who is included in the conversation and experience that public art creates? And what does it mean to use the idea of access as a creative catalyst? A couple of housekeeping notes before I introduce our moderator for this session. For those of you who have joined us previously, you kind of know how this part goes already, but after the moderated conversation between panelists, we will have a Q&A from the audience. So please use the Q&A box that is down sort of center in the menu line along the bottom there. Use the Q&A box to input questions, and Jan and I will co-facilitate feeding these to Kevin once we open the floor for audience Q&A. Our session today is the fourth in our 9-week summit program. We're really excited about the lineup that we have coming up in the future as well, so please join us for all or some of the following sessions. Same time and place, which is 1:30 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when we cover a range of topics relevant to contemporary public art practices from a range of perspectives, all built on the premise of examination through case studies and working models. So over the next 4 weeks, we will cover placemaking, site specificity, temporary programming, and digital public art commissioning. I'll paste the registration link into the chat once I've finished talking, so you can put these into your calendar and sign up for all of them, or just those that interest you. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Kevin Boyst. Kevin Boyst is an independent curator, writer, and former artistic director of Art Prize, where he oversaw artists, operations, and design. He holds an MA in Visual and Critical Studies from Kendall College of Art and Design. His writing has been featured in numerous print and online publications, including the Art 21 blog, where he was a blogger in residence, as well as mnartist.org, Michigan Quarterly Review, and his own blog, kevinboyst.com. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks. So happy to be here, virtually here, as it were. Thank you, Rebecca and Jan, for including me in this. I'm excited to kick off this conversation by introducing some longtime friends and collaborators. So I'll start with some bios of our first presenters, and then I'll come back and introduce our next presenters and moderate questions after that. So Paul Amenta, a visual artist working across disciplines, including site-specific installation, architectural intervention, film and video, and large-scale collaborative public projects. Amenta is the founder of Site Lab and holds an MFA from the School of Visual Arts in New York and a BFA from Grand Valley State University. Site Lab is a nomadic, all-volunteer, artist-led initiative that creates temporary public art projects aimed at facilitating dynamic collaborations between the art, design, education, business, and cultural communities of Grand Rapids. Christopher Smit and Jill Vinn together co-founded DisArt in 2015, an organization committed to advancing a cultural understanding of disability. By taking disability out of the space of speculation and mystery, fear, and placing it in a historical and aesthetic context, DisArt amplifies the voice, visibility, and value of the disabled community. Through public speaking, publishing, cutting-edge programming, and organizational consulting, Christopher Smit, PhD, and Jill Vinn, MSW, have become respected voices throughout the world. DisArt is a production company and arts and culture organization that focuses on creating public art events that cultivate and communicate a disabled culture. DisArt believes that expressions of a disabled cultural identity can transform society from awareness to understanding to belonging, creating a society that enjoys a full and equitable participation of all disabled people. With that, I'd ask Paul and Chris and Jill to tell us a little bit more about their work.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, thank you for that introduction, Kevin, and thank you to the organizers for having us. This is really a unique opportunity that we have been excited about for some time. And we're gonna sort of show some photos of our work and have a conversation about the work that we do. And it begins with this idea of access as art. And this is really the key concept, the key motivator of the work that we've done with Paul and DisArt together. And what we will eventually talk about is how this idea of access as art manifests itself in projects, but also some of the social and cultural conversations that concept brings up and has put us into over the last 6 years of our collaboration. We started in a moment of education. Paul and I and Jill started working together in 2015 when DisArt, which is an organization, as Kevin described, committed to working within disability culture and making sure that disability culture is not only known but maintained through art and other public works. And Paul came in as at the time, an adjunct professor at Kendall College of Art and Design. And we collaborated with him for DisArt Festival, which was a festival in 2015, a 2-week-long disability arts festival. And what you're seeing on the screen here is a close-up picture of a sidewalk and a crack in the sidewalk. And on top of it is a spray-painted stencil with warning lines that says Challenge 01, and under it, disartfestival.org/challenge. And this was actually a project that Paul's students came up with as they began to interact with us about issues of disability, identity, art, culture. They began to really take ownership of those ideas and wanted to get people thinking differently about the issues of accessibility. And so they spray painted these all over the city on different structural issues and structural problems in sidewalks. And so this is just one example of that, but it's important, we bring this up, it's important to understand that like many who come to the world of disability art and culture, you know, Paul bravely entered this this game with us, so to speak. And Paul, I wonder if you might just say a little bit about that, about what it was like to get into the accessibility conversation, especially after having been an artist and a Site Lab producer for so long.
Yeah, in terms of the class, I don't know if I'd use the word bravely. It was, I was asked by a colleague of mine to teach a course on disability and art. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm the right guy. One, I don't know much about this subject. And then she, in a very sneaky way, introduced me to Chris and then to Jill. And through the organization that I work with, Site Lab, we have encountered issues of accessibility, and we built ramps and things like that up until that point, but we really hadn't thought more broadly about the subject. And it was really great being introduced to Chris and Jill and DisArt and the Disability Festival, and them reaching out to us to want to collaborate with them on that project was really insightful. We learned a lot, and also it really sort of set the stage for our relationship and collaborations into the future. So it's been a really great relationship.
I would add to that too, that, you know, from the get-go, we understood a couple different things. One, as Paul just mentioned, a sort of, you know, they had dealt with accessibility issues in the past, but we're really beginning to have this feeling of desiring more disabled people in the work that they do, and to think more critically about accessibility, which Jill, I mean, that was sort of, you know, that was our goal at the time. And so, you know, to find someone who had such a great following too in Grand Rapids, to have that partnership was really, really awesome. Yeah. So why don't we go ahead and move into one of our big projects. Paul, you want to talk a little bit about hybrid structure?
Sure, yeah, this was set in the context of a larger site lab project that was part of Art Prize in 2015 through 2016. And it was a partnership with Habitat for Humanity. They lent us an entire city block, which included 11 buildings, most of them houses that were set to be demoed for a large neighborhood project. And they let us use this site for those 2 years. And the image that you're looking at is a project called Hybrid Structures, which was initiated and conceived by Elois Crunchleger, who's a Brooklyn-based artist who we invited to come in and submit a proposal. We had worked with him several times in the past on large-scale site-specific projects. And he submitted this idea for these sort of elevated walkways that traversed above buildings and through buildings, and sort of opened up these vantage points across this sort of 5-acre site. And he invited myself and architect Ted Lott to collaborate with him on this project. And immediately I saw this opportunity to sort of maybe bend this thing towards a more broader discussion about accessibility. And it ended up traversing and piercing and connecting 3 buildings on that site, and making several of the projects accessible for everyone. And then I think the unique part about it, and Chris and Joe will touch on this next, is it sort of created this platform for several live performance projects, specifically the disability fashion show called Elevate. And that's going to be the next couple slides. And that really sort of, I think, sort of revealed some things, at least to me, and also sort of, I think, foreshadowed some of the projects we're going to speak about next.
Great. So the next slide that you're going to see is a black and white photograph of a large group of disabled people in a parade or procession. They're all marching on a sidewalk in the lawn of the US Capitol buildings, with several wheelchairs being visible, people with service dogs holding up signs that say "We shall overcome," and a large American flag with a wheelchair sign rather than blue and white stars. And we put this, we included this photograph in this presentation because it's the photography, a photo taken by disability rights photographer Tom Olin, and it was actually showcased as part of the hybrid structures that Paul was just mentioning in a gallery that offered some insight and connection between the idea of art as access and access as art, and that interchange between the two, and linking this accessible structure that Paul and Elois had conceived of to the history of disability rights movement, and to identifying disability as a cultural identity, which then when you move into the how we activated it, as Paul mentioned, we activated the site with this idea of like, what are we going to do? This is a massive site. It's all about access. What else can we do except put a fashion show on it? And during the festival, we had a smaller version of a fashion show in 2015, and it was electric. And when this opportunity to work with Paul and Alois pretty early on in the idea and the ideation and the thinking about how do you activate this space, this was, well, this is it. And so what we did is we worked with local disabled models, all people who wanted to, what they said, quote, control the stairs. So we're really getting at the idea of how is disability felt? How is disability, the lived experience of disability? What is it like for people to live in a community where spaces aren't built for us, spaces aren't designed to include us, experiences and production just doesn't cut it. And I say all those things because this ramp was designed early on with us in the collaboration phase to think about who would be using the ramp, who would it be for, why, how does this allow people to traverse to the upper levels of homes that they would not have otherwise done so, been able to do so. And then the fashion show itself, what you're seeing here is a large crowd, which I think surprised all of us how many people showed up, and really excited crowd of people in the streets. And in the background, you can see the ramp. It's about 25, maybe 30 feet in the air at the highest point. And the part sticking out is where the models would come out. Yep, there's Yusuf at the end of this ramp structure, of this platform, just, you know, like with his arms raised to a cheering crowd. And in this moment of thinking about the audience and their experience, thinking about the participants and their experience is this whole experience. In fact, we had projections of sign language interpreters on the larger than life scale on the side of the buildings. And we had screens throughout the audience that would allow people who use captioning and sign language interpretation or had other access needs to be able to pick and choose where they were in the audience rather than a select seat right in front of an interpreter. So this just excited us more to work with Paul, and anytime Paul asks us to do something, we say yes, because we understand that Paul has internalized all the things that we've been talking about around access and art, and really forwarding different ideas into the world, and smashing old stereotypes and historically held assumptions about people.
Absolutely, and I think this is a really incredible moment of the evening, but I think it was an incredible moment for all of us too as collaborators to understand that we were beginning to share a new sort of language, a new sort of structure of thought that accessibility and disability and art could work together in. And so, you know, by the time we get to this, we were revved up. I mean, we were revved up and ready to go. Paul, I'll let you again talk about the space and where this all came up from. This is critical infrastructure, which is the project we'll spend most of our time talking about today.
Yeah, so it's important to also identify that this particular project, so you're looking at the site we chose to build in, which is an old flypaper manufacturing plant called Tanglefoot in an industrial area of Grand Rapids. And this is part of Art Prize's Project One initiative in 2019 that Kevin led, and so it was a commission project. And when he reached out to me to submit a proposal, I immediately thought of Chris and Jill and Ted Lott, the architect, and we immediately got together and started thinking about what we could do here. And we decided to build an accessible pavilion of sorts, an amphitheater that would provide a stage and seating and platforms for performers and an audience to use. And that was welcoming to everyone. And thinking about what we learned from the previous project, incorporating those things into it. And Chris, if you want to go to the next slide, you'll start to see how we conceived, designed, and built this 400-person amphitheater for this Project One event, which was a 2-month event. And then Site Lab, the organization that I work with, we facilitated approximately 30 events over the course of those 2 months. And Chris and Jill organized a couple different projects for the site. So what you're looking at here is ramps and elevated platforms and a stage and multiple ways for an audience of any ability to go up and down and traverse the site and experience things. And you know, essentially freeing people up, an audience, to maneuver through the space wherever they wanted to. Also performers as well. I think there's a couple more or one more image of the site as well. So you'll really start to understand how we started to think about, or let me back up a second here. You know, jumping off from what Chris and Jill said earlier, it became really important to us to really start this conversation from the beginning of the design and concepting phase, that accessibility wasn't just something that was sort of retrofitted on, right? A ramp just wasn't built to get people in. It really became the initiator of the entire design concepting phase. And that was really important to us. And I think,
yeah, I would say you went way beyond compliance, and that's something that is we really, really believe in, and is not always what people consider when they're starting a project. And so from the beginning, this amphitheater was thought about, like, the idea was who was going to fill the space. Right. And when we think about who's going to fill spaces and who's going to experience art, we don't always think about the disability community. But that's why Paul and DisArt, why we collaborated from moment one, from the when it was a dirt, you know, like plot of dirt, and what it could become, because we knew that the programming that we wanted on it and the people that we wanted to fill the spaces were a disability community. We're a community of, well, not just disability, but other minority identities. That you wanted it to be a space where everybody knew that they were taken into consideration in the design of it.
Mm-hmm. And there is a sense, I mean, I agree 100%. And I think there is a sense in the space that it is designed for cohabitation between folks who perhaps aren't normally welcome as a physical body in spaces, to those who are always welcome. And I think that that bifurcation of types of folks and the ways in which the design works. So for example, here you're in the back left corner of the amphitheater. And I think one of the things, and you'll see this in some photos coming up, but one of the things that really works well is the sight lines in this place. You can see everyone at almost every time, at any point in time, where you are on this structure. And that sort of visibility and safety became a bit of a, for me at least, an aesthetic metaphor of the entire stage. That it was a place of belonging, it was a place of safety, and it was a place to find community. And as Jill mentioned, we imagined a particular type of audience in this area, in this structure that we built, and part of that was going to be a celebration, a disability drag show, and this is a photograph. Jill, do you have the image description there? I'm sorry, I don't have it here.
Yes. Yeah. So this is an image of 6 drag performers. Each has extravagant outfits on. Some are blowing kisses. Some are making hearts with their fingers. 3 artists in the back are standing. 3 artists in the front are sitting. All of whom in the front row are individuals who are part of a group called Drag Syndrome out of Liverpool or out of London. And then the 3 in the back are all disabled drag performers from Grand Rapids area.
Mm-hmm. So we had intended for them to come and put on a show that would be absolutely unforgettable. These artists are world-class artists from Drag Syndrome. So the 3 in the back are local drag queens from Grand Rapids, also disabled folks. And then the 3 in the front are the professional drag folks from London. And they are filmmakers, actors, painters, artists, just a real amazing group of people. And we essentially built, the amphitheater for events that would center on acts like this. Tanglefoot, some of you may have heard of this. Tanglefoot is owned still is owned by a gentleman who was running for Congress, a Republican here in Grand Rapids, named Peter Meyer. And when Peter Meyer found out that Drag Syndrome was coming, there was a conflict. And his opinion was there was no way to prove that the artists from Drag Syndrome were making their own decision to perform. And so he questioned their agency, and he questioned the ethics of a drag show with people with Down syndrome. And so it became a bit of a, it became a real conflict, like I said, and it turned into, he kicked us out and we couldn't do our show there. So we had to move it off-site, which was, so disappointing, as you might imagine, raising all this money, building these things, and then not being able to have them perform there was a real tragedy. But it became a source of dialogue, and that's really what all of our projects are meant to do. It became a way to have conversations about what's the place of disabled people in public life, what's the role of disabled people in the creation of art, and what are the civil rights of disabled people who are performers. And so those conversations, we did 3 conversations throughout Art Prize Project 1 about these very issues. I'll let you guys talk a little bit more about that, but it was in some ways a natural outcome of the kind of art that we were making, that eventually we would get to a point in which you bring an authentically disabled presence into public and there's going to be some issues. And so there it was. So I'll let Paul and Jill talk about that for a sec, or add to that.
Well, the thing I wanted to add, it wasn't an issue for the landlord until he began his campaign to run for Congress, right?
Right.
So I had mentioned this project to him prior to that, and he was completely fine with it. And then he decided to run for Congress unbeknownst to us. And all of a sudden, a week and a half before we were to open, it became an issue, and he pulled it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think if we move to the next slide, we get to see what it is to see this this space filled with life. The diversity of life that we anticipated and it was created for. So this was actually the after party after Drag Syndrome and the other drag performers performed at a different location in Grand Rapids, came back to celebrate at Critical Infrastructure and really convincing the drag artists that, yes, you were wanted here. This place was created and specifically for you and other disabled community members. And so after some urging, it didn't take much because they like to find a good party. They came to the site and as they came onto the ramp between the buildings that we've been seeing, it just erupted, and everybody was so excited that they had showed up, so excited that they were part of it. And then you see how there's a woman in a wheelchair dancing on the left side of this, the photograph. And on the right side, it's Chris talking with Ted Lott. And actually, Chris, you said talking in that moment about how cool it is that you're nearly eye level, because of the way that the structure was created. It created opportunities for engagement where normally you wouldn't be able to hear Ted speaking and vice versa. And it was just this beautiful moment. I don't know how, it kind of made us all speechless, I think, in really experiencing it, because it was the opening night for Project Art Prize, and it was the place to be.
I want to say something about that speechlessness, because I think it's really great. When public art and public art events really work, they do take your breath away. And I mean that in the most poetic, but even non-poetic way, that there's a palpable feeling of community and acceptance. When you feel that, and again, there was music and a little bit of alcohol involved and a lot of fun as well, but the space itself was as much of a presence as anybody in the space. And I think that is one of the takeaways from Access as art, that access doesn't have to be something that takes away from the aesthetic experience, but rather that amplifies it in a way that only art can do.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear, Paul, the next image is a different night, but just what it was briefly, I know we need to wrap up, but what it was briefly for the other times, the other 30 events or 29 events that you had there, and how it was experienced.
Yeah, it was amazing to see that sort of energy, that palpable energy over and over again, and to to witness how the space worked and how it sort of through this aesthetic of accessibility that we've been talking about, it really sort of revealed itself to me that we were pushing things in the right direction, and we were making this place that was welcoming, and people came out and used it, which was a really sort of beautiful moment. I want to just go back to that last image real quick and talk about that moment where you and Ted are talking. This is Ted Lott, the architect, our collaborator, and you guys are talking, and I love the fact that you're taller than Ted in that instance, right? And I think I might have been the photographer here, or standing next. It was either me or Grant, I can't remember, but I had that vantage point of watching you guys talk and listening to some of the conversation. It was just a really cool moment. The energy Chris talked about, it was just a really beautiful exchange. And I think that was the opening night. It sort of revealed that this thing worked. All the planning, all the efforts, all the conversation about what we were attempting to do sort of revealed itself, that it actually worked. And that was a really extraordinary moment, I think.
Well, thanks everybody for listening, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Paul and Chris and Jill. That was great. Look forward to talking more about it in a few minutes. Right now, I'm going to introduce our next presenters. Mayan Ziv is an activist, photographer, and entrepreneur based in Toronto. From a young age, Mayan challenged norms to increase awareness of disability issues and improve accessibility. Mayan founded and leads the social enterprise Access Now and holds an MA in digital media from Ryerson University. She's received the City of Toronto Access Award and the David C. Only Leadership in Accessibility Award in recognition of her commitment to improving the lives of people of all abilities. Access Now is a grassroots social startup. The mission is to share accessibility information around the world by mapping as many places as they possibly can, and they invite you to help us, invite you to help them. A worldwide community passionate about change. Together, we can empower each other to have access now. Devin Ostrom is an artist and a graduate of the London School of Economics. His works include a mural/research project in a maximum security prison and the co-creation of a billboard tax that has raised over $89 million for art in Toronto. Along with an MPA with distinction in regulatory analysis, Devin holds an MA in curating and is certified in HR and NPO management. Currently, Devin teaches cultural policy and is a Park People Fellow. Mayan and Devin, I look forward to hearing about some of your collaborations. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, but you're a little quiet.
Okay. How's that?
That's better.
Nothing?
Nope.
No, we can hear you now.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yep.
How's that?
Yeah, we can hear you. That sounds good.
Man.
Devin, can you hear us?
Hello? It was working in our test before.
I can hear you fine.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I can
Yeah,
hear
we
you
can
great
hear
too.
you. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I was the one that was muted. I kept telling you that I can hear you just fine. So yes, we're all set. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Was fantastic. I love the previous presentation. I hope we can bring something like that to Toronto and Markham and have some of the elevated ramps, maybe smash one through a couple of city halls, or I don't know. Great. How are you doing, Mayan?
Good, I'm doing good.
Good, good. Okay, so I'm going to start with sharing a quick sort of video from the news. Just bear with me here. All right.
Being taught the bare minimum.
David, let me get your view on that as well. How much more do you think city planners, architects, designers are taking accessibility issues into account today compared to when you started out?
Well, I can't measure how much progress there's been, but there's been way too little progress. Our public funds their training, and what our architects schools and similar post-secondary programs for design professionals are doing is turning out new generations of unwitting barrier creators, because they keep designing new environments that are replete with accessibility problems, not because they want to, but because whatever training they're getting, it's nowhere near what they need, nor are they aware of the risks that they're taking in terms of their own liability or for their clients when they fail to include accessibility in the design of the environments they design.
We want to actually show an example right now that is not 15 minutes from this studio. Thea, this is the intersection of Jarvis Street and Charles Street in downtown Toronto. And again, for those who are listening on podcast and can't see us, and for our friend David here, who is visually impaired and cannot see the image that we have up on the screen right now, do you want to tell us what's going on in that picture?
So this is an art installation on the southwest corner of the intersection that's in front of a convenience store. There are long blue metal bars that sort of resemble straws that look like they've all been sort of blown over towards the north, putting many of them at different angles and many at head height. So if you were walking along, maybe using your cell phone, not paying attention, or if you were blind, there is no way for you to have any warning before you smack your head on something like this. So this is very dangerous.
David, this is obviously an attempt to beautify the city. Somebody had the idea that this would be an attractive art installation to spruce up a downtown neighborhood, but presumably they didn't take people like you into account when they did it.
This happens to us, unfortunately, time and again, and your viewers are probably scratching their head going, how could somebody do that? But that's the risk that we folks with, particularly those of us with vision disabilities, face every time we go out in our built environment, that there could be something sticking out at head level. At the law school where I teach, they did a major renovation of the Osgoode Hall Law School, and in that major renovation, they installed angled pillars that similarly I was whacking my head on. Now, fortunately, I've raised issues and they, with this, and to their credit, the law school had this fixed, but the design professionals they engaged should never have let them do this in the first place. place, much less have designed it for them to do this in the first place.
This is presumably, though, David, an attempt to make something more visually pleasing or aesthetically pleasing to the eye, and they just don't take into account visually impaired people. How do you get that to change?
Well, you get that to change through two important measures that we've been calling for, that Premier Ford referenced in a letter to us during the last election, and David Onley, our former lieutenant governor, also pointed to in an independent review of our Disability Act that was released earlier this year. What is that? Number one, change the law. Pass regulations that specify what our built environment must include to be accessible, and that where a designer uses those regulations and obeys them, the end result is truly accessible, because our law falls flat on that and has for years. And the second thing is, we need to require that before you get a license or keep a license to design our built environment, whether architects, landscape designers, whoever, that you need to have proper training in how to do accessible design. You can do accessible design that's also aesthetically wonderful design. Mm-hmm. But if you don't know how to do accessible design, you inadvertently stumble into creating these barriers, and then we get whacked in the head.
So that was Thea and David with the AODA Alliance and with Designable. Just a little bit of a touch on what happens when you don't get this right, and the difficulties of working in public space as well, and accessibility and art at the same time. It's a really interesting space, but it's also, there's a lot of problems that we have to be aware of as well. I'm just going to share my Mine and I's deck, and we'll get into it. All right, so we saw that video already. So we're going to actually do a little bit of a policy making exercise as we're doing a presentation, and this will continue on past the session, hopefully. It's a little bit of a draft checklist that we've been working on around how could we access map public art. And if you check the chat window, I'll just drop it in there right now. There's a direct link and a link to some of the other assets we'll talk about in this presentation. So we've, this is a little just a preview of what that looks like. Try not to erase it while you're in there, but add your ideas, and hopefully it'll come up, we'll come up with some sort of, working policy document of how we'd like to design spaces in the future. So we've been trying to do different methods of accessibility mapping. One of our first methods that we tried, and this came about partially because of concerns about with different municipalities and cities around, if we were rating spaces, what were the potential liability concerns, and how. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is para-athlete Anthony Liu with a all-terrain hand car from Icon, and then a Google Street View camera mounted on top of it. And this was a method that we could scan trails and art pieces, and then give people the opportunity at home, so it lives in the cloud, to preview the spaces they were going into before they were there, and do a little bit of trip planning and reduce some of the fear factor of visiting spaces. Some of the benefits were that it was free and it was super fun. And we got to play with a lot of really cool gear. Some of the negative stuff was that it was pretty heavy. Google has since updated a lot of their cameras. Any other negatives or positives that you remember, Mayan, from?
Well, I think for me, what was really exciting about the project when we first started it was that, I've been an artist and I've had a disability throughout my life, but a lot of the conversations were kind of one-sided. Like, how would I be an audience member, at an exhibition or in a theater? And, did someone need to remove a chair for me to sit somewhere, that they could decide for me where in advance I could be. But some of the interesting kind of project outcomes that came out of this work was that we started to see how we could bring a lens of disability to actually creating a medium that people could access with and without disabilities. And so for me, it was really amazing to see Anthony, an athlete with a disability, working with us, using technology to, first of all, create a pretty cool interactive medium, but then also something that engages with public art pieces from an active lens. So he wasn't, being spoon-fed an experience, but he was part of creating it. And it was through his lens that we were then able to share it with many other people who might never experience disability. And to me, that was kind of like a cool outcome of the first time that we looked at kind of bringing art to the online space and world.
Yeah, and people can view all this, the work and the output from that by going to accesspath.ca. It's about 100 kilometers or so of trails and artworks that have been scanned and are explorable. And one of the interesting things about this is as sort of a side effect that we didn't intend on was that one of the largest user groups is parks maintenance workers and parks planners, because now they have a full scan of their trail system that's all GPS tagged. So rather than filling out sort of reports of this thing needs to be fixed there, they can just sort of screen capture or send a link to it to GPS coordinates. You can see some of the output by going to accesspath.ca. And then the next year, we tried again, because we had some unfinished bits. This is an image of Mayan Ziv, who is a very amazing photographer, an artist. And sitting in a power chair with a Insta360 8K camera attached to a GPS module. And then we did about 40 kilometers using this system. Some of the benefits was that it was quite light. It was much, we could transport the unit around the city a lot faster. In some cases, the quality was better. In some cases, the quality wasn't better. We're still trying to figure out some of that stuff. Didn't have the same sort of weather resistance as the Google unit or resilience. What about, from your perspective, Mayan, what were some of the pros and cons of that particular unit? You spent the most time with it.
Yeah, well, to me, the major step, the difference between working kind of with the official Google camera and then moving into kind of an Insta360 approach was that this is also something that is shareable. This is transferable. So, like to our knowledge, when we first did this project initially, it was the first time that someone had ever mounted a 360 camera on a wheelchair in collaboration with Google. And to me, that blew my mind, because Google is like the biggest, most ubiquitous source of kind of information, specifically when you're kind of looking at Street View or search in general. They had never done something like this. So that was really cool kind of from the novelty perspective, but then taking it further to understanding that, we could actually make something that other people could contribute to as well. So this camera, is a camera that anyone can go and buy. And there are different models, down to you could even just use your iPhone if you're comfortable with it. And starting to kind of democratize the way that we go about capturing and sharing information to being not so closed and more accessible to people kind of with different experiences and different perspectives, I think is pretty powerful. One of the things for me that's always been important in my work was that, regardless of when you look at the image and you say, oh, this was taken by someone with a disability or not, the fact that it is, there's a lot of power and identity in that. And I think that often we make assumptions about who is the creator. And by, Devin showing like this picture here, versus the outcome, you often sometimes might assume, based on, you know, your own experience or your own background in art or technology, who would be the natural creator of work like this. And usually it's not me. And so to me, that was really like a very cool way of challenging kind of assumptions and status quo about agency, and being able to use a camera that anyone could use, including a person with a disability, that anyone could go out tomorrow and contribute to the work that we're doing, I think was a really cool next step for this work.
It's pretty expensive though, but we ended up borrowing it from a friend. It was very, yeah. And we put a little ding in it at one point. I think one of all the drawbacks is that it was, on some surfaces, it was quite hard. It's a little, we had some parts of the trail were pretty broken, but that's more of a problem with the situations we were in than the gear. You can see some of the outputs when if you go to accesspath.ca and explore some of the artworks that we encountered that are part of the Pan Am Path. This is a picture at 4000 Lawrence East in the way east side of Toronto in the KGO community, and there's 4 large 140-foot murals called Feather, Palm, Leaf by Dan Bergeron and Spectre. And then also along the Dawn Trail, it's a giant trout by an artist named Quest. It's actually since been horribly vandalized. So it's actually kind of nice to have this record of the piece that's sort of permanently on the interwebs. So as we're moving forward, trying to figure out how can we expand that democratization of the process. And Mayan, do you want to take it away now? And just tell me when you want me to advance the slides.
Sure. Yeah, so, you know, interestingly, we kind of went kind of from more recent backwards. So as kind of Kevin mentioned in a bit of the intro, a few years ago, in 2015, actually, I started a project at the time, which then turned into a tech company in Toronto called Access Now. And it was very much, you know, started from that experience that I had about being a photographer with a disability and trying to navigate my world, you know, trying to show up, you know, at interesting spaces and take photos, or, you know, I'd be booked for a gig and I wouldn't know in advance if I could even do the work when I'd show up at those places. And there were many times throughout my experience, I think even about, you know, I went to high school in Markham, studied drama in the Arts Dork program. And that was actually probably one of my first experiences as someone who wanted to experience my own independence and navigating a lot of the theater spaces that were not accessible to me. And so kind of my entire life's frustration of showing up at places that weren't accessible really led me to wanting to explore how we could share information that would actually help people determine what they have access to. So part of the works that we did with Trails and with the 360 capture was exploring different avenues to bringing more information to people at home, to making more informed decisions about what they would be able to do, where they'd be able to go, and decide for themselves what works. And so Access Now, you know, is larger than art, but has a special place in my heart anyway when it comes to art, because it is very much one of the reasons that it began. I'm gonna just drop the link in so you can mess with it while I'm chatting if you like to. But basically the idea is that people are able to use the Access Now app or on the website and discover places that are actually accessible to them. So you could search for a park that might be having a festival, or you could search for a workshop or a workspace that might have specifics that actually meet your needs. And if you could go to the next slide, Devin. So this is just kind of an idea of the different types of information that we are crowdsourcing. And that's a really important part of this, is that often what I have found, and many other people with disabilities as well, and even thinking on the presentation we just listened to, understanding where you have access and understanding if you've been part of that experience from the design process to the final outcome is kind of a challenging one to navigate. I think that having a platform that can highlight people's experiences based on what they personally are navigating, if that space was welcoming to them, if there are accessibility features like ramps or braille or gender neutral washrooms available or scent-free spaces or ASL, there are so many different assets of accessibility that go into creating an accessible or welcoming space. But rather than deciding, from a small closed group of people who know everything about everything, why not open that up to allow people of all different experiences of disability to contribute to what we then define as accessible art spaces. And that's really kind of what we are really hoping to do moving forward, is really promote Access Now simply as a tool and a vehicle for other artists or other communities to use that fits, their own work and their own practice. Next slide. So it's a really simple kind of 3-step process where you go from kind of rating accessible partially or not based on your own personal experience. And, often people say like, well, what does accessible mean? And honestly, we usually just say, if you can go there and party, no problem, then that's what's accessible to you. And then you can go a step further by actually selecting all of the different tags or filtering the experience on the map. Next slide. So you can actually determine what are the types of features that you might be looking for, and then you could actually just basically navigate your own experience, whether that be for temporary things or for kind of more permanent features that you're looking for. And one of the most exciting things that I just wanted to share kind of about this work is that we've started to actually look at ways in which we could mobilize communities to do that. So we have a concept called a map mission, which is basically people are able to use the platform to go out into the world, whether it be with their spouse or their kids or, a colleague or kind of usually right now anyway, in their own little bubbles, and actually look around their own communities and create kind of a bit of an event around this. In the past, we've done things where we've worked with different arts groups, specifically usually in the past it's been photographers, and done photo walks where we actually go through different areas, rate things based on accessibility, and also take photos, and sometimes run competitions or kind of feature some of the work that comes out of that. So what we're trying to do in general, between the work that Devin and I have talked about, is find ways in which we can use technology to bring the experience to people, make it more visible and more accessible. And that starts with the experience before you show up anywhere, before you go anywhere or do anything. And can that experience be something not just as a viewer, but also as an artist? So can you discover if a venue is accessible for you as a creator, as opposed to just a consumer? And that's kind of some of the ways in which we're hoping that Access Now can be useful to people everywhere. Devin, and maybe I'll pass it over to you just to close. Any other remarks?
So yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, and those mock-ups are older mock-ups. The actual app now is much more advanced. It's my mistake in including those old ones. So kind of we're thinking a little bit now is what would be the best method going forward in mapping the complexity of accessibility and public spaces and public art, and then a pandemic mixed in there too. So what kind of techniques we think will work the best? And that's kind of where we'd like to take the discussion going forward. And hopefully through that sort of get group policy activity that's in the chat, people can add their own ideas of what criteria or factors that we should include and think about as we kind of move forward in that idea of accessibility mapping public art. There's more information. You can also check the links in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Devin and Maya. This is really fascinating to get a deeper dive into this incredible work. I'm going to moderate a discussion now with everybody. I see faces popping back in. This is good. And then we'll also get some audience Q&A as well. I wanted to start out, Chris, asking you to return to an idea that you began with, which is the idea of access as art. And I was wondering if you could just unpack that a little bit more. And I was specifically, could you explain the difference between the idea of access as art and access and art? Because I think a lot of times the approach is just kind of like, art people know art, and then they're like, oh, right, access, that's one more thing I've got to think about. So how does access as art, the as seems important to me. Could you just like, give us a bit more on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kevin. That's a really great question. And you pinpointed the issue in your actual question. When it's art and access, or access and art, like you said, that has funding considerations that we need to think about, but it also has experience considerations. First, in terms of funding, if accessibility is placed on an art project after the fact, in other words, if we would have paired up with Paul at the end of a project, right? Access is not only usually going to be worse at the, when you add it to the end of the project, but it's also more expensive because again, it's not intertwined into the budgets. It's not intertwined into all of the other elements that that are pushing the project forward. Now for us, by flipping it and saying that access is art, two things to say. One is that we're leaning, subconsciously perhaps, but we're leaning on a statement made by the disabled artist Neil Marcus, who said that disability is not a brave struggle to traverse, but disability is an art form. Disability is a beautiful, ingenious way of life. And so this idea of disability as art has always been an important one for DisArt. And so when we began to work with Paul and Ted and Alois and all the folks that worked with us, we began to see a real ability to move the needle forward on disability understanding if accessibility, this somewhat objective, compliance-based practice, if that could become an aesthetic practice, which has value, which has meaning, which has discourse, like anything else, then we really felt like we could change some conversations. So that's the philosophy behind it. Access as art is also a way of saying to people who are making access or making access happen to never let go of the creative mindset, right? Aesthetics and access rarely go together, and you've seen it, Kevin. All of us have seen it. You go to these buildings, even a modern building made in the 80s or 90s, right? And there's still this sort of retro disability junk put on it, right? And then it's like, oh, it's accessible. But it's not until you see a sort of brilliant and beautiful combination of the two, of access and art together, that it sort of dawns on you, like, wait a minute, we can do this better.
Yeah, exactly. Mayan brought up a point which I thought was really interesting, which is something that I think of a lot in relation to the work that Paul does with SiteLab and the collaborations with DisArt, which is this question of who is the creator and the idea of kind of artistic agency. And it seems like there's this common thread between the work that you all do of creating a platform for the creativity of others. And I'm not directing this at anyone in particular because I think that you're all steeped in this world, but I just wanted to throw that out there as something to unpack a bit more now that we've seen deep dives into both of these bodies of work. Okay, I'll pick
I'm
on
happy
Paul.
to jump in. Oh,
or
okay.
no, Mayan. Sorry, Mayan, you go. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. You because you hit that point quickly, and then you went on to other things. So talk about that a bit more and how it relates to your practice.
Sure. Yeah, it started really, from my experience. I grew up with my disability, and I never really thought much about the fact that I was different until I engaged with other people who decided I was different. And I found that, so I picked up my camera when I was 16 and I didn't put it down ever. And when I started to kind of go out into the professional world and pitch myself as an artist, I was met with mixed reviews. And at first I thought, well, I'm new and my work isn't as good as other people. But then I did some tests with my website where I would take out photos of myself that showed my wheelchair and pitch my work to agencies. And often I got meetings a lot easier that way. And I would show up at the meeting and I wouldn't have told them at all about the fact that I had a disability. And I'd show up at the meeting and you'd see this kind of like double take. And I realized it's because they'd never come across in their life an artist with a physical, visible disability. And so that therefore meant that that person, me, didn't exist until that moment. And so I think when we think about who is the creator, there are natural assumptions or kind of unconscious biases that we each carry about who is an artist and what do they look like, what do they have access to, and what do they need. Down to, when I was auditioning for theater schools, people would tell me no because their buildings were not accessible. So I could not study theater because the spaces that were designed for people to study theater were not inclusive to me. So how do you even progress then to being an artist with any kind of craft if the spaces that we design don't include creators with disabilities in mind? And I think, that's what was really obvious in terms of some of the design work that we saw, kind of that Paul and the architect were working on, that showcase like when you design things to be accessible from the beginning, you therefore open up the space for other types of artists to come through. And I think that's quite powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm hoping that you all can talk a little more also about kind of a collaborative versus individualistic approaches to public art and to the types of projects that you're doing. I mean, in the world of public art and in architecture, we're often exposed to kind of a mode of working where there's an individual creator who's a superstar and everything is kind of a signature with their building or their artwork. And it strikes me that you all are much more concerned about building these kind of nesting dolls of collaboration. So talk to me about that and how that relates to these ideas of access.
I'll maybe touch on that for a quick second. As an artist, I've been collaborating for nearly 20 years. So it's a pretty organic process and comes pretty naturally. And I think it, at least for myself, it makes the projects way more interesting than if it were just me as an individual artist. It's not that I don't do that, but I do less and less of it. And I find it way more compelling to create with folks like Chris and Jill and other artists and Ted, a lot, the architect, particularly in this realm of accessibility, right? Chris had touched on this earlier. We've all seen the sort of retrofitted scenarios of, a building inspector comes through and says, oh, you need a ramp there, and you create something that sort of, works in terms of the math, right? The regulations, the 1:12 ratio. But it's not a very compelling result typically. So when you start to think about these things from the start, it becomes an organic part of the process, and it's I think in the outcomes, it's very easily revealed that that you started the process early on, right? And when you invite people like Chris and Jill and their organization DisArt to be part of something, I think it just sort of naturally becomes a more interesting and compelling project from the very start. And I think the outcomes prove that. You know, when you create an accessible, a physically accessible place where you welcome everybody in from the same entry, right? It's not a back door or side door entrance. It becomes this democratic, welcoming place that anybody can engage with. And I think that's super important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I add to that as well as respond to DT's question? Because I think it relates. The question is from a public art administration point of view. What does the ideal process look like for you to ensure that disability and accessibility understanding is embedded into creative artistic decisions? I think that's that collaboration, right? The necessity of collaboration, the necessity of engaging with community, the disability community in particular, what we're talking about today, and understanding that the disability community lives interdependently by necessity and by nature and by choice. And so understanding disability history is where, for DisArt, we always start understanding the lived experience of disability and really opening up to the voices of the communities that you want to engage.
From my perspective, I agree completely with what Paula and Jill said, but I'd like to add also that in some cases artists don't have the resources to do what they'd like to do, and they're constrained by the environment they're operating in. So making sure that there's basic stuff like enough resources to be paying for revisions, I think is super important. Sometimes being really honest about what parts of the process can be open and closed. Sometimes even having parallel processes can work, where you have one part of the process that is artist driven and one part that is community driven, and weaving those two together can give the artist more autonomy. But from a technical perspective, artists are extremely flexible and want to accommodate, but they're also constrained by the resources they have available to them. And in some cases, it requires making sure that there are the resources there to be doing revisions, to be doing proper consultations, not fake consultations.
Absolutely. I've got a couple questions from our distributed audience around the world, which is exciting. First one here, and I'm not sure if this is about Peter Meyer in particular, or it could be more general. See how we take this. How did he react to the conversations about what are the rights/ethics of disabled people? How did he worry about Downs people or other disabled people? I could speculate on that as well. I mean, being involved in that affair.
Devin, I'd like to ask you a question. I don't know, Chris, do you want to take that one? I mean, I'll just, I'll reiterate what I explained earlier. It wasn't a big deal to him until he ran for Congress. And I'll unfortunately share the news that he won his seat, which is discouraging.
Awesome.
Yeah, awesome, right? So I don't know, Chris, if you maybe want to talk a little bit about DisArt's experience with that.
Yeah, Jill, we can do that. I mean, I think one of the things that there were a couple things going on there, and we had to, we talked through it quickly in the conversation, but he did not mention other disabilities specifically. However, in a letter that he published, or that we actually leaked to the media, and I have no problem saying that we did that, because we really wanted to start a conversation, but he referred to disabled people, he said something like, disabled people like children are our most precious, asset, and blah, blah, blah. So there's obviously some issues that he has, with disability in general. But what it came down to was this question of agency, and also the question of the sexual nature of the performance. And I think that for him was the sticking issue. For us, that screams of, a culture's misunderstanding of disabled people as asexual, and as fully actualized agents of their own life, especially as artists. So, Jill, what do you want to add?
I would add also the denying of the complexity of disability, and that if someone has Down syndrome, we have one view of what a person with Down syndrome, what their life is like, what we've heard in the media, what we've experienced, right? Same with someone with bipolar disorder. Same with someone with, name it, right? It's simplified into a box. And while Peter, we were saying, you need to talk to the artist. He chose not to talk to the artist. If he had, he would have known that there's a complexity, and they can speak for themselves. And that's what happened when the artist came to Grand Rapids eventually, and the news was reporting on this. And we had comments from some of the news reporters like, I'm not so sure about reporting on this, how I feel. And then they meet them and they interview the three artists, and they're like, I'm out of here, because this is a great project, and these are incredible artists doing exactly what they want to be doing. And so it's quite complex. But the reality is it wouldn't have been possible if we had not created the space for their art to be created, and to shown and contributed, and the relationships between the other disabled drag artists as well, and were equally part of the conversation, was really powerful. And it's because we created spaces, creating the space for this work to happen.
And I'll just add too, as an update, we did end up filing a human rights violation with the ACLU against Peter Meyer, and that is still in process. But as Paul mentioned, he did win last week. And so we're really curious about what that means for this case and what that means for this discussion. But it was an interesting time, folks. Interesting time.
Yes. And it's painful to see him giving political speeches from that very stage and press photos from his events. I'm sorry to bring that.
Yeah,
I know that went salt in the wound. That went salt in the wound, and I want to move on to probably only have time for one more question, maybe two. So when it comes to public art agencies, cities, municipalities, corporations, I would include art nonprofits in that. That put out RFQs for artists and artist teams. What are the expectations that the teams shortlisted or chosen will be designing/creating with a deep understanding of accessibility? So this question seems to be kind of like, what's the sort of state of play of how that's working currently? But I think we could broaden that out into what are best practices that could be implemented that aren't currently common. If any of you have experience with that.
I guess I don't think that I could give the most educated answer on this, but maybe just connecting so I'm pretty annoyed with the story that you told me. I'm mad and want to go out with my pitchfork and make some noise about it. Cause you're all very polite about it, but I'm also
we've had a year.
It's been a year.
Yeah, okay. So this is my first moment hearing this story. And I have to say, what I'm hearing is discrimination. And it is also, the challenge is that specifically when disability is involved, any issue becomes a political issue. And I think when we talk about how do we move forward now to create spaces, what are best practices? One of the first things that needs to be understood is that people don't know. that we're like just starting to scratch the surface on how do we include people with disabilities in the art process from the beginning stages to the end, and how do we ensure that those voices are heard and respected as well as any other person's. And that's where I think we are, that the first step and most important one is to ensure that we are valuing each voice. And I don't think we are there. So before we even figure out, you know, the lighting or the sound design or the space in which we're creating, have we checked in with ourselves and asked the tough question on, do we value each voice? And if not, because often if we really dig down, we'll find that we don't always know what we don't know. It's how do we create a process that includes people who have opposing or different voices to be part of that co-creation outcome. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all model. This is how you create accessible and good public art for all people. But if you include a nothing about us approach, you will learn because people will directly tell you. That's what we've done at Access Now, is like, we're not telling you what is accessible. We're going to let the entire community speak on what the experiences are. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's just my approach.
I think that's very helpful. And I would also add too that, you know, and I think specifically trying to get to this question, because these are all wrapped up together, but as cities, municipalities, corporations, et cetera, look at these proposals, I would just reiterate a little bit of what of Maya was saying, and to say that if these projects and their proposals aren't expecting the participation of disabled people, then they shouldn't make the short list. I mean, that's probably the easiest way to say it. If they are not assuming that those with visual impairments, hearing impairments, physical impairments, mental impairments, etc., if my community isn't expected to be there, then I don't understand how it could ever be shortlisted. And I think that's just another way to put what you were saying. I think that's a really important thing to
and you can
think about.
include that language in the request itself to make sure that the responses are at least addressing why or why not, or what their plans are.
Yeah, absolutely. Rebecca is chiming in. I think we're about to our time, right?
We are, yeah. Thank you, Kevin, for steering a really, really dynamic conversation. And thanks so much to Chris, Jill, Paul, Mayan, and Devin for your presentations and for the conversation. It's been really inspiring and enlightening, and just kind of picking up on what Jill just said a moment ago about embedding that into some of the calls and the calls to artists that are going out from municipalities and commissioning agencies. Kind of comes back to what Mayan was just saying, which is kind of, we don't know what we don't know. It's so there's this kind of how do we create an environment, and this is like, this conversation has been amazing for making sure that people who don't perhaps know that lived experience of accessibility or issues with accessibility, embedding those into the requirements. And I think, you know, just thinking about some of the things that you said today about disability not being a brave struggle, but an art form and a way of creatively navigating the world. I mean, we should, and Kevin asked about, you know, who is the creator, who holds the agency. I think it sounds like we need to be speaking to artists more and more. You know, we do it as a matter of course, but really in particular with relation to this issue, if we talk about artists or people who are living with accessibility issues as having that same kind of way of having to creatively navigate the world. There's a lot of synergy there. So it's very interesting to think about how we actually move forward and not have accessibility issues be something that is addressed at the you know, near design refinement stage of a project, but more actually as a core element of how a concept is developed. So thank you all for joining us again. Thank you to our audience for joining us. There's been lots of questions, really, really good questions, and I'm excited to share them with the panel and then share them with all of you in the newsletter, as we have been doing, as all of our sessions have generated more conversation than we've been able to manage within our hour and a half together. But before I hand over to Jan for final remarks, of course, mark your calendars for next week's event, which is November 17th, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have a session on placemaking featuring Maria Hupfield and Jason Lujan, artists who work together as Native Art Department International, and Marianne Barkhouse. And we have a bit of a scheduling snafu around our moderator, but our moderator is going to be excellent and the conversation will be excellent. I'm going to hand over to Jan for closing remarks.
And thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everyone. And on this panel, it's great. I think just in a nutshell, and what is accessible design? And I think that's just every single detail, every single thing we do, like every single moment in life, and it will make you think, what is accessible design? And again, thanks everyone for joining us today, and hope to see you again in the next 4 sessions. As mentioned, all the sessions will be recorded and made available online at the Summit website. Recordings of the last 4 sessions are all available now. Everyone who signs up for our live sessions will also receive our bi-weekly newsletter, in which you will find all the Summit related updates and a series of commission interviews. And in the upcoming newsletter that will be sent out this weekend, you will find an interview with university curators at York University, Queen's University, U of T, and UBC on the topic of public art on campus. And that's it for today's session. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day. And goodbye.